your practice is going to, yeah, art is the method of research rather than science. So what will be shown today, I think, will be a real mess of practice, more so than the, as Tim Ingold would say, linearization of kind of argumentation. So that is also just what artistic practice is in general versus scientific method. Yeah, and also coming here as an artist, I was really wondering what all these other topics and things would be shared by the other talks, but there's a lot more in resonance between the last two talks than differences. So I'm really happy and feel comfortable to share. And what I would like to start off with is actually a video. So instead of talking, I would like to show something. This video is 3 minutes long. I hope people's internet works quickly enough. And compared to the gesture method where they're short little clips that are watched repeatedly, I wanted to say that keep your analytical minds on. But yeah, like you would watch a performance in the theater, look at it also this way, as we won't be repeating it. And I'll move to the first here. Here we go. So with the idea of sense making, you can also be reminding yourself how this talk will look at how dance is a type of sense making. There's an annoying green dot due to the sun that can be edited out later. We'll stop there. Something I can also just comment on there. I gave the videographer the same kind of task that I'm doing. Rather than film me, I'm asked him to follow the lines. So his own sense making with the materials in the space is a similar aspect that I'm doing. We'll get into what's happening in that video, but let me first introduce what I'm working on with my PhD research. Similar to what Silva showed in her graphs of trying to draw the lines of what was happening with the children, in a lot of the theories I was reading, and I chose these 6 theories mainly, lines were appearing or emerging as forms attributed to the mind, body, or found in the environment, but they weren't necessarily the topics of those studies. They were just used as forms that became interesting to me. Who's researching these lines? And of course, it took me a while then to find Ingold as one of the few, so that my interest is to contribute to that field, but also then from a dance perspective. So I'll go through these theories briefly and to show how I'm making sense of them, which then when they come together will be the point of the talk. So I won't rest too much on these, but just to give you a sense. So starting with Sheets-Johnston, which has already been introduced this morning, she proposes linear design and linear pattern are aspects of human movement. Simply the linear patterns are the traces we make, as we would know that from gesture studies. So these can be looked at as types of imaginary lines, and linear designs are the sculptural patterns we make. So both happen at the same time, but as a dance practice, I can move from the perspective of linear design. I can think about my architectural positions I make as linear, or I can think about the imagined traces I make through space. Notably, when I think of the traces, I tend to move faster. When I think of the structural, I can move slower, but it doesn't have to be that way. I can move in slow motion and think of the imagined trace behind, or I can move quickly and think of the overall sculptural aspect of my body. Here's a little tangent of a kind of practice I do or a study I do, not as organized as your ELAN or academic approaches. This is my pseudo-scientific artist way of doing it. For example, if you look at the first picture of the woman in white, she moves from start to end, and then she drew what she felt the line of her motion was, and as a watcher, I drew what her motion looked like. So if you look up at the first drawing, the watcher and the dancer, you can see what I observed from the outside is similar to what she felt from the inside. In the second B, I moved and she drew. So her watcher matched similar to myself as a dancer. And then the third line, I moved as well. And as it was a larger movement, it was harder to have the same drawing represent it afterwards because it's more abstract. But you can still see similarities in the drawing. So what we could look at here is that the linear designs and the linear patterns have to be brought together in the drawer, in both drawers, understanding of what just took place. So the lines could be kind of documentation of that sense making of what they felt and what they saw, and then we can see differences afterwards. Moving to the second theory I use, looking at lines, is from affordance theory from James Gibson. Affordances are properties or resources in the environment that are relative to the perceiver. So a chair is sittable, a wall is pushable, a door is openable, a door affords to be opened. And that also relates to human behaviors. So if someone's arms are wide open, you may want to hug that person or hold their hand. So I looked at in my practice as lines and shapes of objects or people elicit movement, movement that is relative to my perceived affordance. So again, if I see a chair, I may look at the outline of that basic property of the chair, and that motivates me to do that affordance motion. So as a dancer, I would sit my body down. I'm not trying to pantomime or convey that there's a chair near me, or I'm not going to the chair and doing it, but kind of like a knee-jerk reaction from the affordances of the space around me. The third theory from Daniel Stern, child psychiatrist, introduces forms of vitality are products of the mind's integration of many internal and external events as subjective experience. Again here, this is what caught my eye, is he's drawing through lines these different forms of vitality. So vitalities are like exploding, pulsing, fading. And in Stern's theory, he feels that these are understood by the child before actual senses are understood. So a child understands an exploding taste, an exploding color, an exploding touch before it can discriminate, this was touch, this was flavor. It first understands exploding. So that's a very basic human form of dynamic meaning making. So simply my practice is I can move my body as exploding or fading or melting, or in Simon's video, the child adorably running to his father. I can give myself that vitality. How do I move adorably? And we know as humans, we know how to do it. It may not be right or it may not be perfect, but moving adorably would be very different than moving stickily or pulsing, yeah? I have conceptual metaphor theory here. Simply metaphor describes one thing in terms of another. Cornelia Muller's revised definition would be metaphorizing as embodied interactivity involves experiencing and understanding one realm of experience in terms of another. So she emphasizes the experience transitioning to another experience. In my metaphor practice, this has become more about sound for me. So the shape and line of a sound, I translate into lines of the body. So for example, here, someone is singing the word see. So it starts off with a long E, you see in my handwriting here, that opens up into a ooh, ah sound, and then the note probably went lower. So in translating the prosody, the vowel of the E that opens to an A, and I would imagine the pitch of this singer's tone went down. And so the female is moving her hands closer to herself and down. And I also went down in my position and brought my limbs towards each other. So we had different expressions of how we translated that, but through the dynamics, we can see we had similar logics. Again, I'm giving you a brief taste here, but I hope it's enough that you grasp what I'm talking about. The last two here are going to get even more wild. From material engagement theory, Malaforis and Renfrew proposed that mark making of prehistoric humans is seen as aspects of extended mind. So the lines are continuations of cognition that don't necessarily represent anything. So I like to kind of describe this as, perhaps I'm not a cognitive archaeologist or a anthropologist, but I guess what Malaforis is trying to go against is that cavemen weren't thinking, let me decorate my cave by drawing a horse to make it more pleasable next to our fire, but is through the engagement of picking up the materials of how our cognition developed. The caveman is understanding what the horse is, and through these lines that leave permanent traces, the horse on the wall is just as much a horse as when they see it later on. So it doesn't represent anything, but it substantiates this concept. As an artist, I'm like, okay, I also make traces, I also make lines. How can I make this into a practice? So I give my dancers the idea, can we also trace the windowsill we're looking at, trace the tide in the beach video you saw, that I'm also substantiating those lines, those concepts of what I'm looking at, but I'm not leaving marks on material. I'm leaving imagined traces behind me. And as a dancer, can I then also, can that have meaning for me? And some of this is tricks we have to do as performers. There's kind of the cliche idea that, you know, in expressive dance or modern dance, the dancers act like the trees or something. This is the 100-year-old joke of why dance is often not liked if you're trying to read it through a narrative like that. So for me as myself, I also have to think I'm not trying to be the tree, but I'm trying to trace the tree in order to bring that tree into my body. And yeah, Ingold even talks about this by saying, by describing, by drawing what you see, you're becoming that object. So it's a deep practice for me to find ways to move. Yeah, and so these are all different approaches where the theories help me make lines with my body differently. The last one comes from Michael Layton, who, if you look at his bio, he says he has given talks on every aspect of anything in science or art. So he is an expert in everything. And he proposes that shape is the means by which past actions are stored. So basically he's saying things all start off as symmetrical, like a circle, and through time and force dynamics, they take on asymmetrical aspects. And as humans, we want to psychologically run time backwards in order to see where that object came from, and the asymmetrical gives us insight to that. And so asymmetry of lines holds more meaning. This little picture I have here is my phone was accidentally on when I was walking in Italy along the beach. And through some drawing application, something in my pocket must have been hitting the flat screen. And so we could say that these traces here are memory storage of the positions I walked along the rocks, the motions my leg made. Perhaps could it also be memory storage of what I was looking at? So yeah, it's an interesting proposal. For my practice, I consider the asymmetry I see in the environment or other people's bodies or my own body as information of the past, and I allow that to move my present. So this can get very slowed down and complicated as a dancer, but if I'm looking and feeling my own gestures, like right now, how did my arms get to this position? And I feel the slight asymmetry. Well, the one hand came from my lap before I brought it up. So do I want to put my hand back down to kind of go back in history, or exaggerate the asymmetry I feel? Or I can do it in the environment. So the idea is that I'm also mixing these theories. So if I'm tracing the windowsill as if a caveman drawing, and the windowsill is asymmetric, then I'm thinking, that trace revealed to me the history of how that window was made, for example. This all falls under my PhD topic of embodied lines, where I group lines into 3 categories: perceived, imagined, and traced. And they don't stay in these categories. They easily constantly fall between. I will continue with the dialogical dance practice. This is what you saw on the beach, and we'll go back to this. But I first want to just, under the idea of sense making, share a couple other practices I've done of linescape drawings and face tracings, again, to kind of show how artistic research goes off in all different directions and yet speak to each other. For example, I have a practice where I sit in landscapes and I trace the motion of what I'm seeing. So these would be cars or bikers or birds. The bigger one is Lisbon, the smaller one on top is Bari, and the bottom one is Amsterdam. So in the idea of sense making, I could say, I'm not trying to have these lines afterwards represent anything, but the act of having my pen on the paper in this moment, as I watch the movement, helps me make sense with the landscape I'm in. And I do like afterwards, then you can look at the drawings afterwards and how do I make sense of it? Why is Amsterdam, what does the Amsterdam drawing reveal at 5 p.m. when everyone's getting off work? That there's more bodies, that the streets are linear and more confined. Whereas above, if you look at Bari on the beach, the people throwing frisbees or dogs walking, there's more circular motions. So lines allow for us to espouse the types of sensing that's happening all the time. I throw this in here. This is something that I just came across that I don't know much about at all, but Ferdinand Deligny has this wandering lines from 1960s research on autistic children. He traced the paths they were in. I can read something here. So he was watching autistic children, and from the outside, he just drew the paths they made. He writes, or Leon Hilton writes about this research. They developed visual systems for designating the various sounds and gestures encountered along the children's pathways to trace the children's daily routes. No attempt was made to interfere with their movements or to explain or interpret them. The focus remained on the process of tracing itself. Yet distinct patterns began to emerge. Certain trajectories tended to be repeated from one day to the next. And Deligny noted that some of the wandering lines seemed to correspond to the conduits of underground waterways. So Deligny is said to be mapping someone's affects. And similarly, the picture on the right, I was watching a dance performance in Vienna, and the dancers were working with the emotion of greed, and I was tracing their motions in a similar way. But I'm also tracing where my eye goes. I'm tracing kind of like the first experiment I showed you between me and the dancer, the mixture of linear traces and linear patterns. But I found similarities here to what Ferdinand was doing. So is this a picture of greed? I also have a practice here where I trace my face with my finger. And in this practice, I had multiple people draw my line that I make on my face. So it's like a group self-portrait or an extended self-portrait. And what could be sensed here? Sense making in this context could have multiple meanings. For one, there could be a play with visual tactile neurons, that what I'm touching, they're feeling. There is creating this relationship that their pen is my finger, their paper is my skin. They're making sense of the motion that I'm doing. So if some people are less paying attention to where I'm touching on my face, the face disappears and just the line as motion appears. And we can make sense afterwards of the drawings. Here's one I did by myself. So when my own finger's touching my own face, I'm drawing at the same time. It has a bit of a different quality. It's more intimate, I would say, because it's my own. So now we return back to the dance practice. So those who are unfamiliar with improvised dance, the dancer is usually doing whatever they want. They're pulling from emotions or wanting to entertain, or maybe the choreographer gave some prompt. But there's the tendency I find that dancers, when they're improvising, are having to think of something in that moment. And I don't really like that. So my PhD research is on how can I give meaning? How can I improvise in ways that use these 6 theories? And so those practices, I was saying, the dancer is incorporating simultaneously to give them theoretical aspects to hold on to. Their body is the site of research and movement is their material. So this allows their perception of lines to choreograph their body. In this dialogical dance practice, the dancer is moving in order to trace or respond to the asymmetrical aspects or certain understood vitality contours in space. The movement simultaneously brings in new features in the architecture as new stimuli to move with. So dialogical is used in different ways, but one way that I want to focus on comes from John Schroeder, as he calls this withness. He pulls from Wittgenstein. But for Schroeder defines withness thinking as a way of thinking in which we permit or allow the unfolding time contours of experience to shape our expressive activities. The spontaneous, relationally responsive, living bodily activity, Schroeder describes, is a realm for activity between people that only has the character it has in relation to yours, that is, in relation to your response to it. Schroeder is a psychologist working in the field of communication. So there's a kind of letting interference with the other person, insight responses. Schroeder reminds us that Wittgenstein called on us to pay attention to tones of voice, bodily movements, gestures, facial expressions, eye directions, and so on, and thus place our everyday utterances back into the circumstances of everyday lives. Then, rather than bewildering us, the detailed relations between particularities within the complexity can arouse quite specific responses in us. So when I read this as a dancer, he's kind of dealing with communication in practitioner relationships and psychologists, or just in everyday gesture studies, you would say. But as a dancer, it sounds very interesting and on point of what we're doing. Based on what I described, this also sounds very much like participatory sense making, already, I assume, proposed by Kufari earlier today with DiPaolo and Dieger. I also find similarities here to the term intra-action from Karen Barad, quantum physicist, queer feminist. She defines intra-action as understanding agency as not an inherent property of an individual or human to be exercised, but a dynamism of forces in which all designated things are constantly exchanging and influencing each other. Yeah, so she's thinking from a quantum level, but then applies this to humanities. Just to be clear, how I'm using the definition of sense making, because I understand there's other definitions out there, from DiPaolo, Kufari, and Dieger, is the capacity of an autonomous system to adaptively regulate its operation and its relation to the environment, depending on the virtual consequences for its own viability as a form of being. Other definitions here are bodily, cognitive, emotional form of understanding, or from Alva Noah, simply just stimulation that one understands. The lines of objects and how I situate myself around them, and the lines that I make and trace with my body in a responsive nature, I would say constitute a form of sense making. When these discussions on affordances and behavior revolve around the topic of artistic expression, as in my practices or cave paintings, sense making takes on a different value and an ambiguity when it is beyond biological agency and autopoiesis. So for example, I found the conversations often kind of sometimes get to the cellular level of does the organism go towards the light, or sense making biologically, does the animal follow tracks to know where to get its prey? But when we're dealing with art, there's a whole different ambiguity in what these sense making is doing in the environment. DiPaolo also, and all from the Linguistic Bodies book, also describes that sense making does not add meaning to the environment, but instead subtracts from it by responding to only certain influences on the sense maker. I would like to now share another video where we dance in architecture instead of in landscapes, and two of my dancers in an interview process will share what they're doing, and I think it's very insightful, better than what I could say. So we'll go to this next 3-minute video.
Sometimes I feel that the dances are not so different from the material architecture insofar. So if another dancer says there's a huge difference for them in the perception of an architecture or another dancer, I can understand that, even though I think I have another take on it, because for me, I shift my attention very much depending on do I conceive of the architecture as something vivid and alive, in something which is talking to me, which I do in this practice, then there's not so huge of a difference or a bigger common ground between another dancer and the architecture. On the other side, if I think of a human body as different lines, then the link is there to architecture or line space. But I also think that the dances can, sometimes I see kind of a chain direction or a domino effect. When I see 2 or 3 of other dancers in front of a wall, for example, then I can imagine that one dancer would somehow take the materiality of the wall or the color. The second dancer refers to the dancer, to the first one, and then I would refer to the human body, which is relating to a human body becoming gray.
So today, when another body entered space, the practice that I felt really came up regularly through the different runs we did was the affordance theory practice. I feel I was busy with the geometry of people's bodies and the gaps, places where I could interact more than, say, their materiality. So if I think of the beton or the wood, or the cement or the wood, I didn't think so much of skin and brains and livers. I thought of an arm and a room to go and somewhere to pull.
I'll stop there. So to end with, I'm going to throw a big tangent out here now at the moment. I came across in this research, we have the ecological perspective of agency from James Gibson and the enactive perspective of agency from Varela and al. And historically, they're opposing each other, but there are new ideas of how they can be looked at simultaneously, which would be called a combined as a radical embodied theory of agency. So for me, the concept of embodied lines as a dialogical dance practice, what the dancers are doing here, uses lines as an organizing principle for sense making. In doing so is how the practice could exemplify this ecological and enactive perspective at the same time. And the feeling of these two approaches to agency, the line of sense making, where different matters come together, the mind, body, environment, I propose could be called a metaphorical type of foam. So where Simon was looking at kind of the metaphor aspect of wave, we have a theme today. Foam came to me as a place where two matters meet. And I'm using this in kind of the Karen Barad way, who talks about what comes to matter, what has meaning, comes from where we make cuts in matter, in actual distinctions. So where we have made a cut between ecological and enactive, and these two fields over decades have kind of, through mattering reasons, matter differently. Foam is where two matters meet and then create this kind of, as we see in the waves, this edge. So foam is created from spontaneous generation. Foam is a type of edge, a boundary between two surfaces. Foam is thus a product of sense-making. Broad speaks of what matter comes to matter. Foam is the feeling of dialogical dance practice where agency and sense-making are negotiated and described through the environment-dependent and actor-dependent goings-on that begin and end in the dancer's body while dancing. Yeah, the point also of foam is that there's this fleeting temporal quality. Foam can kind of be seen as this in-between phenomenon. The thing with foam from waves or the tide and the wave crest is that they're constantly there, but just new. Our ability to see differently and make new meanings, as seen in the dance films, is also changing, but we're constantly there still translating the lines. So foam for me also feels like it's conceptually where we can look at these two matters coming together. In my dialogical practice, where all the theories come together, like all the theories hitting, but it's also this, it's this kind of in an Ingold way, the line that we're entangled with. So I'm proposing that this foam line is the correct metaphor to look at because it's always there, as our bodies and movement are always there. So there wouldn't be these units, but it's also ephemeral and constantly changing. So that brings to the end of what I wanted to say and share. And I open any questions for what parts struck your mind.
Michael, thank you very much for the really inspiring talk. I really enjoyed the many concepts you introduced there and the examples you gave and the material you shared with us. Thank you so much. So as Michael said, there's time for questions and answers. The floor is open. Vicky, do you have a question you'd like to jump in? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think so. Hi, Mike. Hi,
Hi,
Alan.
Vicky.
Hi. Yeah, really fascinating talk, and it's interesting because I've followed your work for a few years now, and yeah, there's definitely an increase in clarity of direction of where you're going and the ideas. So that's really fascinating to see and experience. I'm also, for other people, I work with dance, and I'm sort of shifting more towards the dance practice as a research method. But one of my concerns or questions is always that I can understand how, as practitioners, there's somebody exploring these ideas, we learn a huge amount from the process. But I've got this nagging feeling often of what does it offer to others who don't experience it themselves. It's how does it get communicated? How does it expand the knowledge base for more people? And I believe it does, but I just don't quite understand how we can do that. I just wonder if you had thoughts, if that's a question of any value.
Something that comes to my mind is I think it was Simon's talk, was that surfers are saying they're dancing, or gesture studies say it's like dance. The fact that it's like dance bothers me a bit. It's putting dance as the metaphor for something else, when surfing, gesturing, and dancing, what Sheets Johnston would say is movement, is dynamics of movement, is meaning. We cannot not do it. So, you know, Sheets Johnston is kind of opposing the term embodied and wanting to replace it for animation for this very reason. So the first thing that comes to my mind is any research into the dynamics of meaning making and movement. I mean, this is where I fall into the gesture research of also working with Alan, because this is the overlap of meaning and movement. So any research into that, I think, is actually monumental. And this is where Ingold and others are pointing towards that. And that's why I was happy to also see Simon introduce some of these bigger questions. I don't know if that answers it.
It helps. I think. Thank you.
I mean, I know what you mean. It's the yeah, if you're looking at dance as a field of performance or art, it can seem, is it enough, or is this contributing to other aspects? But yeah, if I look at, and this is where I found I'm doing so many different practices, from drawing lines in the environment, or I'm not trying to be a landscape artist, or but just researching movement in general has so many ways it reaches other fields that I think is often neglected.
Yeah, I suppose partly what we need to do is get more people to do it, and so that they learn that what you and hopefully I are doing, and many others, is trying to get an understanding of what dance can offer as an experience, as a research method, and then spread that, get more people to do it so that more people understand it, rather than just talking about it. I think, yeah.
I mean, it's interesting. Where does the gesture stop and a dance begin? When I one time put my own video into the Elan software to try to look at it that way, of performing, does it just have to get bigger? Do I have to go slower? When am I dancing versus when am I simply gesturing? And I can play in that gray area of, and you feel it when it's a normal pragmatic gesture, and when am I slightly embellishing it? But as dancers, we're constantly hyper aware of what we're doing all the time. I don't feel comfortable giving talks, but when I think of it as a performance, then I switch on a different part of my brain.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for that question, Vicky and Michael, your answer. I see that we're joined also by Alan Cienki. Welcome to the room, Alan. And I see you've got your hand up. Are you ready to dive into a question already?
I am. I just wanted to pick up on actually what Vicky and Mike were talking about, that I've said to Mike several times that I think I can easily see how he could do all kinds of workshops for companies. You know, we're getting managers and workers and staff to then do some of these practices to understand each other better. You know, so you have like managers learning, or let's say workers observing their managers and making these kind of drawings, you know, these kind of other movements as they're going about their day, whatever. So this kind of things where you then see, understand the person in a totally different way. You don't just think of like, you know, what are they telling me to do? But then you think of what are they being in their everyday work, you know? So to try to like put yourself in their shoes in a sense, by then understanding something about their movement practices, which is like a totally different way of thinking of what they do every day at work. So I agree with what Vicky was saying, that like getting more people to do these things then is a way where the ideas, the theories and the methods can then carry over and then maybe help other people actually in different ways. But I also had another thought of what Mike was saying about like, what's the difference between gesture and dance? It's very similar to then the question of with static art, you know, when is a representation of something, when is an image that's a static image then a work of art? And so, and this has been dealt with in various studies, you know, in terms of one approach says that it has to do with the kind of aesthetic context, someone thinking of this as something aesthetic, and then that makes the thing art. So I think it's a parallel kind of question about movement and dance. But I had a question actually for Mike about the second to last slide where you had the quotes from Barad. And I was wondering about this issue, right? So the issue of unintelligibility. And even though this is a session on sense making, I was wondering if you could say a bit about not making sense. So is part of the value of the practice is realizing when something is not making sense? So like what's the foam is the border between these different things, is what's the border between like intelligibility or making sense and unintelligibility, not being able to make sense out of something? I wondered if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder if, I don't know if, and just speaking for me in my practice, if there's ever not making sense in the act of trying to make sense of the rocks or the environment I'm in, or the architecture, or dancing with another body, the act of this sense making is the practice in order to then make sense of something. I would say that the sense making comes first. And so the sense making cannot not make sense, because it's the action of trying to put things together. So it's then if afterwards I don't make sense out of it, this gets then into meaning making. It maybe, does it have meaning that's relevant to me, or that I can't put my finger on?
Or I was thinking of also, let's say someone observing your practice and they can't make sense out of it. They don't really know what's going on. Is there value? It seems like there's value. It's in that itself of realizing the difference between when someone can think they can make sense of a situation and when they don't think they can, and then starting to question, why is it that I am not being able to figure out what's going on here? So like the value of realizing that you can't really understand something.
Mm-hmm. But this is also why I really like the term withness, because this, if someone's watching something and they can't make sense of it, there's this, what I would then say, that's this aboutness looking, this reflective, trying to name it afterwards. Does it have meaning? And the actual act of when they're watching and engaged in this temporary unfolding, and they're trying to understand it, this is this withness, this is this sense making, and they don't know that they're not going to make sense of it. So in watching the spatial, temporal, energetic contours, they are getting it, because they're humans who have slapped and tapped as kids and have all these embodied meanings. I would say it's their adult need for narrativity or meaning making afterwards that then stops that kind of innate actual knowings that are happening in that moment. So I know you're asking something slightly different there, but
this gets at the different senses of sense that you were playing with, that then in some ways there's sense that's sensory, and in other ways there's sense of, like you said, narrative, logic or something. And so people might just not be tuning in at a level and the moment that then gives them something.
Thank you for that discussion. I think also it's hinging on some different notions of sense making as experiencing and feeling, and sense making as understanding, reasoning. Yeah, I like the notion of witness as well. It's very interesting. So let's see if we have any other questions for Mike.
it made me also think of the differences between Tim Ingold's correspondence. This is a noun? Would that be correct? The concept, is it a noun? Where sense making is a verb and witness is an adjective? Why I'm attracted to this witness? It's that ness, it's that the qualitative how, more so than a verb or a noun.
I haven't thought about correspondence, sorry, as a noun, because he often writes to correspond with the world is to
right
in their correspondence, in corresponding with So I don't think it's necessarily a noun. Just when he makes the distinction between interaction and correspondence, that's when you see it. Like,
yeah, exactly.
Those are the quotes I was taking. I love those final thoughts about foam and froth. Really interesting, you know, especially thinking about the waves and the crashing waves. Surfers often talk about the flumph that you get when a wave has gone past, and you really experience that, especially if you get caught in it. It's really a form of, yeah, as you said, it's cresting, it's on the verge, it's becoming, it's there, and it's kind of an in-betweenness of matter, isn't it? The froth, bubbly, watery, but airy as well. It's aerated water, more so than the non-froth. So yeah, why could you say a bit more about how you came to thinking about this froth? I mean, we can see it in your images, the way it slides up the shore as well and lingers before dissipating back into the ocean and then before another wave.
So for that exact reason, I mean, in Ashish Johnston essay in Tim Ingold's book, The Imaginary Consciousness of Language, she cites this temporality of foam in the poem that inspired Farella and Roche to invent the term inaction, but they're pointing out the movement aspect of that poem, and she points out the temporary foam aspect used by that poet. And at the start of my research, this really hit me in that lines are often always seen as something static. Most people think of lines as A to B, or think of them even only as straight. This has been over years the conundrum somehow that Tim Ingold is really pushing against, that lines are often anything but straight. But when I thought of foam, it was this, it's a line that has this total ephemeral quality. And there's something hypnotizing about this, that it's, when you look out into the ocean or the tide, it just keeps coming and coming and coming and coming. They're constantly there, but constantly changing. And I was also thinking in regards to the wave, it's also a result of a wave. It's after some dynamic force has happened. I'm also thinking literally now, in unbalanced force, yeah? There's more in the water than in the air. So the two matters hit, it's probably asymmetrical to some extent. I also didn't, researching foam or the idea of foam as a line, I didn't intend to go out and then dance next to water foam. This wasn't a linear thing I needed to do for the dance project. I wanted to also dance at the top of the mountain, but then we saw that there was a path down to the beach, so we did it. But I share that just in regards to how artistic research goes in different directions, and you don't know always what you're gonna get at the end. Which is really why I liked your presentation of the mix of the metaphorical aspect of waves, but really looking at waves, or waves. It sounds quite artistic, actually, what you were doing as well.
Yeah, when you mentioned at the beginning of your talk, hold on a second, I got it here. Oh, where is it? Aha, yes. Art is the method research rather than science. Yeah, I think, for example, the way that I prepared my talk, as you could probably tell, it was a little bit wavy in itself, was just to move from one image and thought to the next, and let that determine the structure of the presentation and of what I wanted to share with the audience, rather than beginning kind of top down with a structure of maybe introduction, methods, results, or findings and discussion. But what that led to was this kind of in-between, I think, presentation where I didn't quite get across the artistic sense but then I was also, you know, I left ideas unfinished, and I didn't talk about methodology at all, and my examples were not very well. I didn't have nice segues between them, but I felt that that was a way of developing the talk that was more suitable for talking about waves and waving bodies and correspondence and relationality than kind of imposing an academic structure onto that.
I think it was really insightful, and it also then uses other people's way of listening and taking in information. So maybe it made more sense for me in that type of non-linearization, and the more poetic of what I'm used to getting meaning from performances or with open ends.
Yeah, also you mentioned something right at the beginning of your talk. We'll just see if there are any other questions here. I don't want to hog the time. Any other questions for Mike there? Oh, about the general question. Well, we did record all the talks. We'll check with the speakers and make available and see if we can make them available. So yeah, watch this space for that one. Any other questions for Mike?
Yeah, I would love to.
Yeah, Silva, please.
I really liked your talk, Michael. Thank you for that. And I'm still struggling with the definition. It also was Alan was addressing of understanding and sense making. Because when I read, you know, one of the definitions that you brought up in one of your slides, I think it was by De Jager, how they define sense making. It's, for me, it always seems that they have this kind of outer perspective, because like following Klessner, for instance, he, for instance, takes the Innerlichkeit, inwardness, like the inner feelings into account, that of course also frame or influence how I perceive the word, right? So this is one aspect that I have the feeling is missing in De Jager's definition, but I would like to know how you understand, how would you define understanding or sense making, or is sense making understanding? Because understanding for me often implies a more like reflective stage of perceiving the word, like more from a post perspective, like I see something and I understand it cognitively, but what is understanding for you from a perspective of being a dancer and making sense of movements and making sense or bringing feelings into movements and things like that, all that that you were describing in your talk. So do you have like, how would you define this process?
Yeah, I think this definition of an embodied emotional cognitive understanding, I wrote that that's what dancers are usually aware of anyways. We are aware of our emotion, cognitive, bodily aspect of understanding, and to actually then give that to the dancers and say, but you're also sense making. You're also trying to understand the things you're doing in relation to the environment and the other dancers as this level of not necessarily coming to agreement, coming to an answer, but is a movement process that's trying to understand. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I understand that the term is used differently in different fields.
Yeah, that's why I had the feeling that, okay, my idea of sense making is something different than understanding. It's maybe yeah, I don't know. Just some thoughts I had while you were talking about the different ideas coming up when you
yeah, I've even read some definitions that sense making is objective. It's like all the people in the end can say, oh yeah, point to this made sense. Yeah. And meaning making is the term used for subjective understanding. And I found that really strange, because the inactive philosophers that I'm reading use sense making really much more as this responsive,
right. It's also because you
blur.
You also cited Daniel Stern, who conceives interaction as dance. I mean, interaction is dance for him, like what you said in the beginning. And I think he would also define understanding as something more, you know, basic than being on a level of interaffectivity of affect, that you respond to someone's expression of affect, right? So is this where understanding begins, or is understanding more like on another level, right? This is what I was thinking of. Yeah, thanks.
This is why I like Schroeder and Wittgenstein that point towards this withness knowledge that we often forget. I'm making sense now using headphones on a Zoom talk of how loud to be because I can't see all of your faces, or I'm seeing multiple faces at the same time. And if we were at a table, I could turn and look at you and these people would be in my peripheral vision, but now everyone's in my front vision. So this affects how I speak. So without knowing or understanding, I'm making sense of this situation. And that type of knowing how to go on as a sense-making process is often ignored. And so that's the type of sense-making I'm valuing.
Okay, thank you.
If I can also just add 2 cents worth, the term sense-making in certain fields in the social sciences also really has to do with more about what's going, like what I would call framing. So like what people, when people are in a certain context and they try to figure out what's going on here. So they think they're at a business meeting, but actually it's an kind of argument taking place between 2 people at the meeting, and that kind of takes over the meeting. And so this idea of what's happening here, which some would say is, how are you framing what's going on, or how is it being framed by the participants, is different than understanding what's being said in the context. So maybe it also depends on the field of study that you're coming from as well, how the terms are used.